Hi, my lovelies. So we're going to look at population distribution today, and this is 2.1. Our tidbit of the day is that the average age of a person on Earth is approximately 29.6 years old. The median age of a person in Japan is approximately 46.3 years old, while the median age of a person in Nigeria is approximately 14.9 years old. And look down here at the bottom, we see how age is distributed across the world in this nice little population pyramid, which we're going to learn how to read and create. Our learning objectives for today and for 2.1 are to be able to explain that where and how people live is essential to understanding global, cultural, political, and economic patterns. And we're looking at factors that influence the distribution of human population at different scales, methods geographers use to calculate population density, and explaining the differences between and impact of methods used to calculate population density. So the first one up is physical and environmental factors. And we're going to first look at climate. So we're looking at where population is distributed based on these different factors. So climate, first off, is not weather. Weather is hour to hour, day to day, week to week, but climate is overall averages of temperatures, precipitation, wind, and other atmospheric conditions. So things like a place that's prone to hurricanes or monsoons versus a place that's prone to snow or dryness. Those are climates rather than something like what California's been going through, where they've had a drought. That's not climate, it's weather. But if we look at the American Southwest, that's a desert, that's climate. So climate also helps to shape soil and vegetation and agricultural opportunities. So if you are in a desert, you have fairly limited agricultural opportunities. If you're in a wetlands, you still have fairly limited agricultural opportunities, just a little bit differently. Humans tend to flock to temperate climates. So they like moderate temperatures, they like adequate precipitation. We don't like anything too hot or too cold. We don't want it to be too dry, and we also don't want it to be too wet. But technology can help us to live in previously less habitable places. So we can do things like have air conditioning, and that makes places like the American South, places like Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, more habitable because we counter the heat and humidity. Or the north part of the United States, where we have heat in the winter and can make that more habitable all year round. But extreme climates still remain largely uninhabitable. It's very difficult to live in places like Antarctica or the Arctic Circle, or in extremely hot places like the Sahara Desert. All right, next up, second physical and environmental factor, landforms. So these are the natural features of the Earth's surface, things like mountains, flatlands, plateaus, water, all of that type of stuff. Humans tend to live in flat and low-lying areas because these are easier for building, for farming, and they make transporting goods and people easier. This should say goods right here, I just missed an S. Soil is deeper. Land tends to be richer for planting when we're on flatlands because it's not being blown away all of the time like it might be, or it doesn't go downhill like it does on a mountain. Habitable land has adequate water sources, lakes, rivers, things like that, has relatively flat terrain. You might have hills, you might even have some low mountains, but you don't tend to have very high or very steep ones. And it has an ability to produce food, which is relevant to both of these other factors. River valleys, river deltas, and river plains tend to have very, very rich soil. So that kind of goes back to that one up here where the soil is deeper and very rich so that you can grow more crops. Rocky and steep terrain tends to be very difficult to navigate. It's hard to walk over, it's hard to put animals over, it's hard to drive, and it's hard to build on, so it's more difficult to put roads or train tracks or anything like that, and it's hard to grow on. So oftentimes it might not have adequate soil depth. It might just be too difficult to dig into, or it might just be too steep. And finally, higher elevations are colder. So the farther you go up, you get cold because you're losing oxygen. So every 1,000 feet equates to about a loss of 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Physical and environmental factors number 3, water bodies. So humans need fresh and ample water to survive. We get this from rivers, from lakes, from oases, and we can dig into the ground and access aquifers. We need it for agriculture, we need it for industry, we need it for sanitation, and we need it for hygiene. We use it for all of these purposes, and that makes us need lots and lots of it, because we do lots and lots of that stuff. Dry and drought-stricken areas tend to be difficult to inhabit. This can be somewhat countered by technology. We do have desalination, which can take the salt out of salt water and make it potable or drinkable, but it's very, very expensive to do. You can ship water, but that's expensive because water is heavy, and it's taking it away from somewhere else that might need it and can potentially cause issues in that area. So if we look on these two maps that we have right here, they're both China. So the one in the bottom left-hand corner, you see this is a population choropleth map. And the deeper the color, the more people. So we're looking at millions of people. The darkest colors are 100+ million people, and the lightest are only 0 to 10 million people. And if we look up here, we can see that the patterns here are very significant. So as we're looking, the most heavily populated areas that we see on this map coincide with where we have rivers on this map. We have a large section that is not very inhabited right here, coincides right here. Now, it does say it's a plateau. However, we're in the Himalayas right here, and that's going to make it a little bit difficult because they're very, very, very high, very cold, and tend to be pretty dry. So we do see that there's some water that goes up into it, but it kind of stops as far as rivers go right here, right around the edges, and that's going to coincide with where these higher populations are. But mostly these big, heavily populated areas are coinciding with places where we see the Yangtze River, the Wu River, the Han River, the Yellow River. All right, so to kind of summarize that, climate, we need temperate climates. So moderate temperatures, adequate precipitation. Technology can help overcome some issues, but it doesn't help significantly in extreme climates. Landforms, we need relatively flat lowlands, or we prefer them, and they're easiest for us to inhabit. And we need to have clean, ample water to survive, fresh water in particular. Technology can make dry places more habitable, but it cannot completely overcome a lack of water access. So remember, as we're thinking about these things, ecumene and non-ecumene. Ecumene is the portion of the Earth's surface occupied by permanent human settlement. This is a multitude of factors. It's realistically looking at humans can live there long term, so they do. Non-ecumene, on the other hand, is the area of the Earth's surface that humans consider too harsh for occupancy. It's too hot, too cold, too high, too wet, too dry, something like that. And that's approximately 35 to 40% of the Earth's land area. So these are really important to note. Basically, if humans can live there, they do live there. And if they can't live there, you're not going to find a whole lot of them. All right, we looked at environmental and physical factors. Now we're looking at human factors. And the first one is economic, so anything dealing with money. People tend to live where they can earn a living. Weird how that works, huh? So we are looking for places where there are agricultural jobs, industrial jobs, service jobs, and other activities. So Human migration is primarily driven by economic factors. The number one reason that people move and settle in a place is money. So can they make money there? Can they afford housing there? Can they afford their lifestyle there? Number one reason. One of the most significant periods of human migration, and that's going to influence settlement and population distribution, is going to happen as part of the imperialism and colonialism eras. This is going to include the forced migration of enslaved peoples. So triangular trade, particularly forced migration. People have to move because they are forced to do so. It's basically either you move or you die, as part of African enslavement in particular. And then natural resources attract humans. So if we tend to settle in places where we can extract them, so there are jobs, we can process them, different jobs, we can transport them, or we can use them. All of those things are really good economically for human settlement. Next up, we have political factors. So when people are unsatisfied with their government or their political system, they may voluntarily migrate. If I don't like what's going on in my particular political system or government, I might be like, you know what, this place sucks and I'm leaving. So I may voluntarily migrate. Unstable political systems and wars may force people to migrate. So this is kind of the other side. You could choose to migrate if you just don't like it. If it's unstable and dangerous to live in, you may be forced to leave. One notable example of this is the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. So the Khmer Rouge were the Communist Party in the 1960s to 70s, primarily. And they take people from the capital city of Phnom Penh and force them to move to rural areas. During this time period, the leader is a man by the name of Pol Pot, and he and his government, the Khmer Rouge, will cause the deaths of about 1.5 million to 2 million people easily by starvation, by execution, and by working people to death. That is an unstable political system that is forcing people to migrate out of the city to rural areas and ultimately resulting in their deaths. Governments can also incentivize population redistribution and encourage migration through a number of policies. In Brazil and in Nigeria, they both moved their capitals inland. So Nigeria moves from Lagos to Abuja because it's more centrally located, and they want to encourage people to move inland and occupy the entire state rather than just the coastal areas where Lagos is. Brazil did something similar when they moved their capital inland to Brasilia. So they started to encourage people to move inland by moving the capital there. And when you move a capital, you're moving all of the jobs and everything that goes along with it. We also had the Homestead Act in the United States, where the government would encourage people to move westward and expand and fill the United States by essentially giving them almost free land, huge plots of free land, 40 acres. If they could go out there and they could stick with it and live on that land for 6 months out of the year. And if they could do that for, I think it was 5 years, then they got that land. They got the deed to that land, and that's going to encourage a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't be able to afford to buy any land, much less very large parcels of land, to move westward and settle the country. Then we get into cultural factors, still dealing with human factors. So people move and settle in places for a number of cultural reasons. Is there housing available? And note that kind of also goes back to that economic factor. Is it safe? Is there access to transportation? So do they live near public transportation? Are there major highways nearby so that if they need to go to work? They move to places, or they live in places where they have a sense of belonging and a sense of community. And if they feel like outsiders, they might settle somewhere else, and that's going to change where population is distributed. Religion is also really important. Again, we're talking about culture and we're talking about where people are settled. So if you happen to be an outlier religiously, you may feel less comfortable and you may want to be with people who are more culturally similar to you. And therefore that may change the settlement of an area. Role and status of women is also really important, and this includes the socialization of men and women within cultural norms. If there's a lot of emphasis on that men and women do not socialize, that may change how many people are settled there, and whether or not they go to other places or come into that place. And then also familial attitudes towards love, marriage, and children. Really important. Are you settling somewhere where family is important, where children are important, where girls are more or less valued than boys, where you marry for love, or do you marry for economic reasons or status? All right, and then finally in human factors, we're looking at historical factors. These are often intertwined with other ones. So if we have a huge devastating economic crash, such as something like the Great Depression began in 1929, that's going to change where humans are living in the United States, because they're going to start moving around quite a bit. Or the Irish potato famine, that's going to encourage many Irish to move to the United States, to migrate to the United States, and it will forever change the numbers and the settlement of the US. And there are more people who claim Irish heritage living outside of Ireland, particularly in the US, than there are people living in Ireland, and that's pretty significant. So if people have been settled there, then they'll stay settled there. As people migrate out of Africa with the earliest humans and start settling in places like what's now the Middle East and farther outward, that's going to influence that population distribution. So they start settling in places that are more temperate, more habitable. And then finally, historic distribution of settlement is often linked to the region's present population concentrations. So if a place has a significant population, then most likely, a really dense population, then most likely they have a very long history of human habitation. So think of places like India, very densely populated. China, very densely populated, very long histories. Sparsely populated areas tend to have a less established history of human habitation. So think of places like the certain regions in Latin America. And again, just to kind of briefly overview these ones, economic, the number one reason that people migrate or settle in an area is for money. They settle where they can earn a living. For political, people prefer to live in places with stable and safe governments and political systems. With cultural, a sense of belonging and community are very important. People settle where they feel safe and comfortable. And finally, with historical populations influence modern and future ones. And lastly today, we're looking at densities. So we talked about these already a bit, but we want to kind of differentiate between them again. So population density overall is the number of people occupying a unit of land. This is really similar to all of the other densities, but most particularly this definition relates to arithmetic density. So this is the total number of people divided by the total land area. It's very limited in detail. It doesn't account for other stuff in there like arable land, like imports or exports, none of that. It's just saying how many people, how much land, total. Next up, we have physiological density. This is the total number of people per unit of arable land. And this may drastically differ between countries. Sweden and the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, for example, both have very drastically different physiological densities than they have arithmetic densities. Sweden is significantly covered with ice, so they lose a lot of their land area as arable land to tundra, while the UAE loses quite a bit to desert. So they may have rather more strain, more pressure put on their land by the population. And that's one of the significant things about physiological density. Arable land, remember, is land that can be used to grow crops. And finally, we have agricultural density. This is the total number of farmers. So when we're thinking agriculture, we're thinking farmers per unit of arable land. The higher the agricultural density, the more likely the country is developing. This is directly related to subsistence agriculture, which is the farming to support one's family. When we are a developing country, we need more farmers because we tend to be farming only for ourselves. We can't go to the grocery store necessarily and buy our food. We have to grow it ourselves. We're not importing a lot of food. It's all from us. Therefore, we have more farmers because our farming is less efficient. In developed countries, we have very large farms much of the time, or we import quite a lot of food, but we tend to have very few farmers, relatively speaking. All right, that's it for today. So our learning objectives were to be able to explain that where and how people live is essential to understanding global, cultural, political, and economic patterns. We identified factors that influence the distribution of human populations at different scales. We defined methods that geographers can use to calculate population density, and we looked at the differences between and the impact of methods used to calculate population density. So what I want you to do in your notes is to take a couple of minutes to explain how physical and environmental factors influence population distribution, and then identify an example of how human factors influence population distribution. Note which factors we're doing where. And finally, I want you to describe how population density is different than population distribution. Remember, note your task verbs there. So take a little time, do that. Go back and rewatch this video if you need to. Take the mini quiz when you're all finished, and have a great day. Bye.